So best practices on how to receive below the container. Now we know that each each of each dispenser functions a little bit differently. Some of you guys are receiving at the tote level. Some are scanning individual bottles and cases within the tote, and that's what we're referring to as receiving below the container. Essentially, what happens is your supplier is sending you the EPCIS file, which has what we call the TI, which is the transaction information and the transaction statement. And that's what we collectively refer to as the T2 data. And it's going to include that item level information for DSCSA compliance. That file comes into your US compliance application, which is what stores the T2 data. And then it also passes it over to Serialized Operations Manager, which is where you do your receiving. And in both cases, we sort of maintain the different serial numbers and the aggregation hierarchies that came in from the supplier. The physical product is going to then arrive at your pharmacy or your warehouse receiving location, and then your team is going to perform that process of receiving and reconciling the information or the serial numbers that you received. And I think the key thing here is you're going to be reconciling it against the T2 file or the T2 data, which is the compliance data. Just a quick reminder, there's a few different ways that you can receive data in TraceLink. One is through the user interface, and you can do this with like a wedge scanner as well, so you can scan the barcodes. TraceLink has our SIT application, which is a mobile application that you can use for receiving. Or we have ways that our customers are integrated with another system where they're receiving in that third-party system and then sending the data back to TraceLink or just receiving it in the system that they're using for like their inventory management. So there's a few different ways that you can do it. Before we get too much into the receiving side, I do want to just take a step back and talk a little bit about the barcodes, just because this has come up sometimes on some of the calls I've been on. So DSCSA does require what they call a 2D matrix barcode, and sometimes people refer to this as like the QR code. And that barcode has 4 different elements. There's what they call the GTIN or the global trade item number. Think of this as sort of an extension of the NDC, and it's unique for every single product and at the packaging level. There's the serial number itself, there's the expiration date, and then the lot number. And you can see some of that information in that graphic on the right, which is kind of what we call like a human readable form there. If you were to look at that full serial number, when someone scans that barcode, it actually is going to look like what you see on the top there, where there's that 01. It then lists the GTIN, and then there's a 21, and it will list the serial number. There's the 17 and the 10, and that's how your barcode scanner reads it. Those are what we call segments. However, on screen, you don't really need those segment indicators. In fact, it will look sort of without those parentheses, so it's just going to be a really long number. I bring this up because sometimes people have said, well, my serial number is, in this case, A37F9834F93G. And you have to remember that that's really just a part of it. Like you can have multiple products that have that same serial number, but when you combine the GTIN and the serial number, and then even like the lot and the expiration date, now you have a very unique number here. And that is what is the full serial number that is on that bottle or on that case. The other thing I want to mention is that when you are entering this data into Serialized Operations Manager, you don't need to enter in all 4 segments and include those parentheses. Really, you can just do the GTIN, well, essentially the sort of the 01 followed by the GTIN. Then there's that 21, which is the sort of indicator that this is going to be the serial number, and then your serial number. So you can just enter kind of those first 2 spots or first 2 segments just to pull up a serial number on screen. So if you're checking like the status of a serial number, that's all you need to do. You can't just do the A37. You do need to do a little bit more information. Next up, we have our linear barcode. This is a 20-digit number. This is going to be for your logistical unit. So it could be for a tote, it could be for a pallet, it could be for a case that has, mixed product in it. And there's a few different components of this as well. One thing to remember is that your barcodes that are your linear barcodes that are your SSCCs will always start with like a 00 in the beginning. That's the application identifier that indicates to your scanner that this is like a logistical unit. And here's an example of one below where you can see that there's that 00 in the beginning, and then the rest of the components that make up an SSCC. And then an SSCC stands for serial shipping container code or serialized shipping container code. This is a serialized, but SSCC is a lot easier to pronounce, or just this is like your tote, your case, or your pallet. Okay. So we talked a little bit, or I mentioned a little bit about sort of reconciliation. And with DSCSA and how there's this unit level compliance, we have to change a little bit how we receive and how we reconcile. So in the past, you probably reconciled, you would get an ASN that says I have, 20 of a certain product, and you probably reconciled that against an invoice or a purchase order. And it didn't really matter the serial numbers on those 20 particular items. It was more at the lot level and the product level. It's a little bit different now because we do have to look at that unit level. And when we receive, we're receiving against the T2 compliance data. And for this reason, so what's happening is the way that the upstream suppliers and vendors are sending the data is that they're sort of aggregating a lot of data onto a particular delivery or T2. And this can cause some challenges with receiving. So we're going to talk a little bit about reconciling against the delivery number, which will help prevent issues that occur when receiving. Because when you receive in TraceLink and you're using the user interface, we understand what is defined in that file. We understand if it says there should be 20 of product A. And if you were to scan in 19 instead of 20, we'll tell you. Or if you were to scan in 21 versus 20, we're going to tell you. So because of how there's multiple deliveries and POs that are sometimes combined on these T2s, it can make it complicated when receiving and can result in some errors when scanning. So we talked a little bit about how those T2s were created. And I have sort of an example here on screen. So we have a single T2 document here that we're using as an example. And inside this T2, you can kind of see that there's multiple delivery numbers. And then within those deliveries, you can have multiple totes. And then within the totes, you can also have multiple POs. So you can see this hierarchy that is developing. And then within those POs that are related to the totes, you then have all your serial numbers. And it's really important that when you're receiving, you do receive against the correct T2. So this is just a screenshot of TraceLink of the serialized operations manager. And if you look under on the left-hand column here, these are some examples of multiple deliveries. So we had a T2 document that came in, and in this case, there were 2 deliveries mentioned in that T2. If we look at the top one or the bottom one, you can see that there's a lot of different deliveries that were all sort of aggregated into that T2 when it was sent from your upstream supplier. And then on the right, all the way on the right-hand side, we have what we call like the business transaction identifiers. So we have ASN values that are listed there, which typically relate to the delivery number, but there can be other values as well. And in this case, you can see that we have a PO number that is found on both of these deliveries. So 2 completely separate deliveries, which can happen all the time. They send you a product, they don't have everything in stock. So you get another delivery the next day or later that day that has the remaining items for what you purchased. So as I said before, it's very important that when you receive below the tote, that you are receiving that serial number against the correct T2 document and delivery. So in my graphic here, I do have a few different T2s. I have one on the left, so I have my T2 number 2, and I have a T2 number 3 on the right here. Each T2 contains a particular PO. So these are my T2s. And then, so for this P2, as an example, we have PO number 1, and there should be 4 of, we'll call it GTIN A, to keep it simple. So then I have my 2 POs on each delivery, and then these are my GTINs. And you can see that these are kind of spread out across 2 different T2s. So when you receive, you want to make sure you're receiving against the right one. So you can see I have an arrow saying that this person is receiving GTIN serial number 1 against delivery 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this makes us happy. These are my really high level graphics here. We have another situation where somebody is scanning this GTIN A serial number 2, and by mistake, they're scanning it against delivery 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is going to cause problems because it's going to offset the count. And then you're going to have validation errors when you try to close the delivery. What that person needs to do is make sure that they receive GTIN A serial number 2 against the delivery that it came on, which in this case is 976531. If you guys are able to do that, and I know it's a change from your current receiving process, because like I said, you've never had to receive by delivery this way. You've always received either by invoice or PO. It will help reduce some errors that can occur. So if we talk about best practices for receiving here, we'll talk about what do you want to do. So you want to try to identify the delivery by entering either the delivery number directly into the SOM UI, or you can scan the tote, which is probably the easier way to do it, because you can scan any tote and it's going to pull up the right delivery. You don't have to worry about typing in the delivery number. That will kind of make it easier. The other part is when you're receiving, it's best if you can kind of keep your totes separate, because that sort of limits the commingling of product. Just because you have 50 of a particular product and they happen to all be the same lot, you don't want to mix them up, because that T2 document is very specific down to the serial number of which item should have been shipped and received with that particular T2 document. What you don't want to do, and we know that this is one of the practices that people do, is sometimes they put everything on a table first. They take up everything out of the tote, combine them onto the tables, and then they do their counts and they say, okay, my PO says I should have 50 here, and I count 50, and now I'm going to scan all 50 serial numbers. That's going to result in some potential issues. And you still can, search by PO, but typically if you search by the PO, you may end up seeing multiple deliveries that occur in TraceLink, just the way it was sent by the supplier. So then you have to make sure that you are picking the correct delivery number to receive against. So that's why we recommend picking out the or specifying the delivery number first to make sure you have the correct delivery and T2. So this is the top of our SOM user interface, and you can see here, this is where you would enter the delivery number. But if you are going to, scan by tote or type in the tote, and we talked a little bit before about what format you want to enter that serial number in, you can put that into that middle column there, and that's going to pull up the specific T2 and delivery that you're looking for, so you can ensure that as you receive, you're going to be receiving against the correct T2 document and delivery.